Hi, I'm Ken Harmon, founder and editor of West Trade Review, and welcome to the newest edition of our PostScript interview series. Today, we are pleased and honored to have with us poet Dare Williams. A 2019 PEN America Emerging Voices Fellow, Dare Williams is a queer HIV-positive poet, artist rooted in Southern California. He has received support for his work from John Ashbery School for Homeschool, The Frost Place, Bread Loaf, and Tin House. He was the co-curator of the West Hollywood Literature Festival in 2021. His poetry has been nominated for a Pushcart Prize, Best of the Net, and Best American Poets 2021. His work has been anthologized in Redshift 5 by Aereo Seco Press and is featured in Thrush, The Shore, Exposition Review, Night Heron Barks, West Trade Review, and elsewhere. Dare, welcome, and thank you for being with us.
Hello.
Hi.
Thanks for having me.
So let's just start with a big, broad, sort of philosophical question.
Sure.
Deeply introspective. You ready for that?
Yeah.
Who is Dare Williams as a poet?
Oh, gosh.
How long do we have, right?
I guess what comes to mind when I hear that question is like who my speaker is. And I guess my answer would be something that I've recognized in my work is that I think my speaker is this tender wanderer. Um, and I think that's informed by when I was younger, growing up, I didn't want to be home. So I did a lot of walking. Um, and I think it's like as I was walking, coming into my poet self, I have my antenna on, so I'm hearing things, sensory details, and also going very introspective, so exploring like the interiority. Um, I was telling a poet friend the other day, I think that my speaker is also more benevolent than I am, in terms of like a sort of compassionate eye. Um, and so often I'm surprised in my writing with what comes up in terms of like, I guess the gaze. Yeah.
I like that idea of the tender wanderer. That's beautiful, actually. You
Yeah.
mentioned that as a kid you didn't like to be home very much. Could you talk about that a little bit and maybe how that's kind of revealed itself some in your poems? Any particular poems?
Yeah. And I guess also like the sort of like why poetry, right? Like why is poetry my weapon of choice?
Hmm.
I grew up in like a small suburban town. Um, and there was a lot of, my house, we moved around a lot, but also like a lot just adults trying to figure it all out. And there was a lot of chaos, um, a lot of neglect. And what I learned is that if I could hide, and kind of go unnoticed, I could just like do my own thing. Like I became very aware that, gosh, these folks aren't going to help me out, so I've got to do something.
Hmm.
And so I think about, also just, growing up in poverty, it's like, no way was I going to be like a cello player. And, and it's also like, and that's noisy,
Yeah.
it's like, so sort of like, you know, what does Winnicott says the like that quote about like the artist needing to like show or be known and then also to hide, right? That
Hmm.
like and so if I could get really small, there it is. And so but I started a journal practice, not
Hmm.
knowing that it was a journal practice because a pen and a journal are pretty cheap and pretty quiet. And so if I could go away from sort of scenes of the crime, you know, and just like write in my little books. But I also think that I started journaling as a way of, I'm going to put in sentences what's going on, or what I'm feeling, because I think in houses like that, certainly in mine, um, I wasn't validated, and what was happening wasn't really acknowledged.
Right.
So in a way, it's like I was noting evidence.
Hmm.
And I think what happened naturally is that because I was also into music and I was in choir in school, I'm hearing musicality in language. And so I naturally start to write through my own language. Um, and later I would learn like this is syntax, rendering the self through syntax. But I would hear like natural sort of breaks because I think I just had like a natural musical ear,
Right.
you know.
How old were you when you started journaling?
Um, Pretty young. Like I would say probably like 7 or 8.
Wow.
I have all my journals to
Oh,
this
wow.
day.
I wish I
Yeah.
had some of mine. I journaled a lot too, but I didn't really start until high school. But I don't
Yeah,
have any of those things. So you're so lucky that you have all that. What's it like to
yeah.
look back on your younger self and read some of the things that you wrote back then now?
Yeah, I haven't done that in a while. I did it not too long ago and was talking with a poet friend, and I said, just for like just to see, like in a way of like how much I've grown, or just like what was happening. And two things happened actually that I thought, oh no. One was that, and I feel like this happens with a lot of poets that I talk to, is that I could see like there was definitely like a definitive voice. Sometimes I'm like, what does that mean? But like a voice emerging, and I guess it's like finding my form.
Hmm.
And so obviously it was like very left justified, and but I would say I had some pretty good line breaks. Like I think that is something that has come to me naturally
Hmm.
in a intuitive sense. But as I've grown in my writing, I think what often happens is like, oh no, like, am I growing in my writing, or am I getting away from what I was doing back then before I was aware of anything? There is something that sort of happens to a poet that I think has to be guarded, where we're kind of in our own sort of cavern of space, or like our ecosystem, and then we get public, right? Like we start to publish,
Hmm.
we get in programs, we get into workshops, and so it's like, oh, wait, like how do I maintain this sort of purity that was there, um that carried this electricity, as well as be in community, or workshop, and being published with other writers.
Do you remember the first time you shared some of your poetry publicly?
Yeah, actually, so there was, growing up, I grew up in Laverne, California, and what's great about Laverne, California is Claremont, which is next to it, because it's got the colleges there.
Uh-huh.
And this is like late 90s. And so what was so great is that me and my friends became friends with older queer people, older people of color. Um, there was like the music, hip hop, jazz scene was going on. And so there were these coffee shops that would have open mic nights. And I would just, very shy, get up there along with others and just read out of my journal,
Super cool.
almost in like a, yeah. And it was like, and that's also, slam and stuff was happening then. And just like a whole collection of people, pre-internet for sure. And then watching the internet happen. Um, I used to actually have a Tumblr for a while called Midnight Magazine where I would publish my work and then publish like work of friends,
Uh,
and then I took that down. Yeah.
Too bad that's not up there anymore. So was there a moment where you sort of maybe intellectually made the decision that you were going to be a poet, or was it something that just sort of evolved from those journals, would you say, naturally?
I guess like a combo of the two, because I sort of like early 20s, I was like, I'm going to do this. And I was reading poets that inspired me and trying to like find out like what they were doing. And again, this is like before kind of like the Twitter that we have now and like Facebook. And so it was all kind of like people you were meeting. And sure, there was like AOL and things like that, but information, I guess, in terms of like pathways were not as easy to come by. And like, how do I publish? Like, what does that look like? And um, but then I basically, I started believing like a narrative that wasn't true, and I was like, I'm not going to do this.
Mhm.
So I started just working, like, I started getting into production here in LA. I was in art department, but I was always writing like off to the side.
Mhm.
Um, and then something happened where I just kept writing, and then was starting to kind of like come out of the closet with some friends that I was like writing poems, and I only was showing to a very select few, and it was getting like great feedback, like people were
Mhm.
like, I think you have something here. And so one of the first things I did for myself was I applied to the homeschool because it was coming to Claremont. And before that, it was in Hudson,
Mhm.
um, in upstate New York. And so I thought, that's local. I can do that. I'll just drive back and forth. So why don't I just apply? And then I got the acceptance. I was like, okay, okay,
So it became real. It became real at that point.
it became real. And it's so fascinating because, like, so the way they did it is we all stayed in a cohort, and then the faculty changed, and the faculty was like my dream faculty. Some real like poets that I had been already learning from for so many years, like off to the side without being enrolled in any kind of undergrad program or MFA program. And so that was my first official time ever in like a group workshop.
Mhm.
I really felt so like internally just freaking out because there was all this shared language. Because
Right.
most people that were in homeschool, they were either already in an MFA program or like an undergrad program. So this is just what they were doing kind of on their break.
Uh-huh.
And so there's like a shared language in workshop spaces when it's sort of filled with those folks that I had no idea what to even, and sort of faked my way through, fumbled my way through. But I quickly learned that I could bring something else to the table as like a workshop participant that was coming from this like outside, because what I was speaking to wasn't always coming from sort of this institution
Right, right.
way of thinking or looking at poems.
I think that's a benefit for a lot of people, honestly, is to have, that sort of not institutionalized view of what poetry is supposed to be, kind of thing.
Yeah.
So who would you say some of the poets are that have influenced you most? Or they don't necessarily only have to be poets. If there are others like artists or photographers or fiction writers or whomever, Who would you say some
Yeah,
of your big influences are?
yeah. So I guess I'll start with poetry and then maybe zoom out to photography, and music. I guess so, like, talking about that time of, like, journaling and being in high school, like the 90s, there was sort of this, like, beat revival happening then. It was like MTV was sort of making that stuff cool, um, and, like, alternative rock is what it was called, was sort of having that happen. There was, like, a Burroughs and Ginsberg kind of revival happening with, like, rock and roll, and I was like, "Okay," and then but then for me, like, where I was living, it was like hip hop was coming into that too, and so 2 things sort of I discovered them sort of around the same time was, like, Eileen Miles, and then I'm watching Def Poetry Jam, and I see Patricia Smith, and so
Mhm,
and then I'm like, "Okay," so, the first time I encountered a Eileen Miles poem, it's like, "Okay, so the form kind of looks like mine because it's these left justified mostly. Sometimes just one word is a line. I was like obsessed with the line breaks, like what is happening? There's like I feel like there's velocity going on because of the way that like just my scansion is happening. And I didn't know what scansion was at the time. I'm reading it, and just like the leaps that were happening of like, okay, um not even, like, knowing, like, what's happening in the poem, but
mhm.
knowing that when I'm done with the poem, I'm in an emotional state that I wasn't before I read it, and I was like, "How is someone doing this with language?" So I gobbled everything I could up, just like and then you have Patricia Smith, I'm seeing her perform Skinhead, this persona poem on Def Poetry Jam, and I'm just watching her and her, just at the mic, this like spell work in a way, because I'm just hearing all of this sort of like robust language that is like washing over me. There's like musicality, there's jazz, there's like, all of that. And it's also very dark and honest, you
Mhm.
know. And I've been fortunate enough to be able to work with both of them in workshop settings, and it's been really incredible. Um, and also, Eileen's sort of auto fiction, fiction, and writings about art. Um,
Mhm.
there are more important things than Iceland. That collection, I was encountering that was like, oh, oh, okay, like I can write about experiences like this.
Mhm.
Like I think before that I thought I had to write in like either a very academic jargon way or like maybe sort of like this like a magazine kind of way, and reading how they were writing about visiting galleries and artwork and like being with their friends, and it sort of gave me this permission,
Right.
you know that I don't think I had had before.
How do you think those influences have sort of materialized in your own work?
I was talking with a friend the other day. She said that I'm really good at line breaks. So, but yeah, and so but I was like, right, because that's I'm because I don't come from traditional like um education. I'm this autodidactic, right? So I'm reading, first read is for like, let's see what's going on here, sort of pleasure read, and then reading again in like with the scholarly way of like doing a close reading, like what is happening as I'm encountering and exploring this work. And I think in a lot of my work sometimes like it just comes out that like, oh, naturally like I'm reading miles, because
Mhm.
of the way that I break a line and why it happens that way. And then with Patricia, I she wants the deepest and darkest from you. So it's really about like not being afraid to go there, you
Right.
know, and 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 often like what I've learned from her is that when I'm writing a poem or drafting a poem and there's something like I can feel internally what I'm wanting the poem to explore. Not necessarily like what is this about, but like what am I exploring as I'm writing this poem? When it doesn't work, it's because I'm clearly circumnavigating the thing that I need to say.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh
I
well,
know
that's why
exactly
this is
what you mean. I know exactly. I do the same thing
yeah,
sometimes.
yeah. So like, oh, this isn't working because I need to go there.
Why do you think we don't go there sometimes as writers?
I would say I'll just speak from my experience. I'll say two things. I think sometimes we don't go there because I would say that like the market, the institution is can be hovering over our heads more than we think. And so there's that, like what will people or like is this too, and then I also think um I think we also hold space around like how can I go there? Like who's in this poem? Who am I exploring? Um no, 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 I can't do that. It's like I'm gonna stop the excavation now,
Right, right.
and I'm gonna press the eject button. But then for me, it's like, but that is like, I have a life. I've had a life that is very interesting and colorful. And so it is in a way like the gift that keeps on giving.
Oh yeah.
And there's a lot to like, there's a lot to mine there. And um, you know, some days like the veil is thinner and other days it's like, no, I don't have it. So okay, I'm gonna just look outside and
So where do you find your inspiration most often for your poems, or or maybe what inspires you in the first place to put the words to the page, would you say?
yeah. Um it's interesting because like in this like in the collection I'm working on, like with my manuscript, there is a lot going on with like memory. Um so that's interesting, kind of like the work that one must do to sort of go there. Um I've been thinking a lot about like nostalgia, like nostalgia is a fantasy about the past, but I get nostalgic because at the time my present was stolen from
Mhm.
me, and so um I'm having to go there to write about things because I'm trying to reconcile those memories, those moments, um, through language and form. And on in sort of like the present is that like I think I'm still a walker. Like I live downtown and so I'm walking a lot and I'm always like keeping my eyes open, my ears open. I think too, like I just poets, I'm always asking the deeper questions, like just like I'm not satisfied with like the first answer. It's like
Yeah.
I wanna get to I was telling you I was telling a friend, like, I'm the person that's like, if I'm at like a gay bar and they're playing porn, I'm the one that's like, do you think they're happy? Like I just like I want to know about them. Like I just so
Yeah.
it's not like whatever is like whatever's played in front of me or whatever is in front of me, I'm always wanting, I'm like, and then what, and then what, and why, but why? Just there is this like inner psychology, I think, that poets are very interested in. Um, and then to just see what happens, like, or is this, with lyric, it's like you can get all kinds of, you know, experimental and, all sorts of things. Or like, is this like a straight up narrative, of, and often like, I think my work rides the line between the two, um, because I'm wanting to explore these experiences, but also because of like the music I was talking about. Like, I've definitely just drafted poems with words that just sound so pleasurable
Mm.
sonically, and have to read it back to myself going, is this anything? Is this, is anything happening here? Like, what? I feel like I was in a blackout when I drafted this, but okay, maybe this was just an exercise to put down a list of words that sound pleasurable sonically.
So you mentioned being at the gay bar. um,
Yes,
how have your lived experiences as a queer man helped to shape your own queer poetics?
right. I think talking sort of, like, so Gabrielle Calvacaresti and I were talking about this, and they mentioned that, being aware of your surroundings at all times is very queer,
I think so, yeah.
and so like, and that's me, it's like, as a hyper vigilant person due to childhood, um, having everything tuned, attuned to what's going on, um, and policing the body. What kind of spaces are we in? Um, I would say like my hypervigilance and queerness definitely hold hands. It's like, who's here with us, who isn't here with us, who's, where are the exits, where are the, like, what's happening, kind of thing. So there's kind of a, I would say, like, within desire, because that is rife in my poems, certainly, and queer poetics, is also like, where's the threat and chaos?
Right, right.
And I would also say, like, if poems allow us to talk to ghosts, certainly, you know, ancestral voices come in,
Hmm.
um, artists that we've lost, that
Oh,
kind
yeah.
of thing.
Are there any particular queer poets that you think have been influential to you as a poet in any way, or that you just admire?
Oh yeah, I mean, Eileen Miles, for contemporary, Denez Smith for sure. Um, this is always funny. It's like, why, when we get asked this question of like, who influences you, and there's all my books, like, we go blank.
I
You know
did
what I
the
mean?
same
Like,
thing, yeah.
I feel like this is a universal thing. Like, people ask you like, well, who are some of your favorite writers? It's like, they're all behind me on my bookshelf, and we go blank, but like, like Miles, Eileen Miles for sure, Dennis Smith, um, Tommy Pico, um, Sam Sachs, um, more will come to me. There's so many more.
Oh yeah, for sure, for
Yeah.
sure. Um, have you written any poems that you consider particularly queer and empowering?
Yeah. Um, well, okay, so well, it's funny, like, there's this poem that I wrote it like a few years ago, and it's funny, I just pulled it up last night. And it's one of those that I think is just gonna keep writing me, and at the same time, um, I feel like it's pretty much there, but I keep I keep messing with it. And so maybe it's one of those things that's just I need to, like, let it go and call it done. Um, but essentially, it's this poem that I wrote, exploring the time that I overdosed.
Mm,
And at a house party, and it's all about, like, just the body, like, being in that sort of liminal space and thinking, like, "Well, have I done all I could here, like, with this queer body? Like, is it time to go?"
mhm,
Sort of, or do I have more to do? Um, and sort of this community care that happens where I was saved, you know?
mhm.
And because I'm in a state, I don't know who's handling me, both physically and psychically,
Right, right.
carrying me through that moment. Um, and I guess certainly like writing poems, dealing with relationships, something I learned from Terrence Hayes was like the idea of like not always making your speaker the sort of victor, the winner,
Mhm,
like, is it possible to hold the speaker accountable with what's happening in the poem? So I think one of the things that I like to explore in my work is how queer people treat each other, not realizing that they've been affected by like larger, bigger events.
right.
So, like, why do we ghost? Like, why do we ghost each other? Why do we treat each other certain ways? Um, what is a safe space? Like,
Right, right.
um, in order to be inclusive, you have to be exclusive. Like all that kind of murky, and certainly like thinking about I can't have all my poems where I'm the one being ghosted and I'm like the victim, It's like I have to turn the camera on myself and say like what have I done and why am I compelled to do that or what's going on there? Um and I think doing that can be empowering because um there's a kind of like there's an agape love there, not just eros
Mhm,
and philia, there's agape, which is holding each other accountable.
right, right. So what do you think the purpose of poetry is? Is it to demonstrate what the world can be or what the realities of this world are?
Mm. Oh my gosh. I think it can be both. I think I think a poem certainly has the power to say, well, okay. I'll say I think a poem certainly has power, and where a poem is like most potent is when someone has experienced something and has not quite read it put into language or a form, and when they do they can say, oh my gosh, me too. So the poem has now met that person.
Right.
And on the other side, and maybe in the same poem, depending on what the poem is doing, um, it can certainly say, this is what the world can be. This is, um, if you've done this or you've felt this, there's also this part of it where you can also do this and feel this, which is like the other side of it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. So in a previous conversation that we had about your poem Blue and Green, which we are publishing in the spring edition of West Trade Review. You said it was a very vulnerable piece to write for you,
Mm.
and you pointed to some specific themes of relationship to mother, addiction, class, and secrets. Could you speak to the importance of being vulnerable as a poet? And maybe even talk about, what was it specifically difficult about being vulnerable when writing that particular piece?
Yeah. Uh, well, this I think is a really good example of I brought this poem to Tin House Workshop with Patricia Smith, and the original draft was in couplets and doing these associative leaps, and it came with a lot of questions. My amazing, lovely cohort had questions,
Mhm.
and so it's like, hmm. And so then it was suggested, like, what if this was turned into a bit of like the American sonnet, something like a Wanda Coleman would do, um, which like lowers the stakes a little bit of having to like put it all into like a sort of rigid sonnet, like have it be more relaxed. But just having that little note and doing that, I realized like, okay, well, here's now space to fill. And now the actual scene is being rendered in a way that I had first been thinking about it. And now it feels true to the intention. Um, so then now there's more details, right? So the
Right.
details of what's happening is like, oh, so was somewhat like surprising for me what came up in the final version.
So what did you set out to do with that poem and maybe some of the earlier versions? And then what do you think you ultimately achieved with it?
Yeah, it's like I think in the earlier versions, I think honestly was trying to have a little more like velocity with chaos, which is not as soft. So maybe in the reader having a little like wanting the reader to have a little more panic. And now in this version, even though like what's happening is devastating, there seems to be a softness about it. Um, and the and I think also too that like the the speaker is redeemable in this version, and in the previous versions was not.
In what way?
Um, I guess when I say redeemable was like the speaker taking responsibility for their part a little more in like the relationship as a whole and
Mhm.
just what's happening in the scene. And the previous versions was not like that.
Yeah, yeah.
But also too much hiding was going on. So that's why it was difficult to find out what is happening.
Mhm.
So for me, this is like a good example of just tell us what's happening. you know, just tell us what's happening.
Uh-huh.
And in the end, I think the reader benefits from that.
Good, good. Um, why don't we go ahead and I was going to have you read Blue and Green. Why don't we go ahead and do that now? And then I'm going to have one more
Sure.
question for you after that.
Okay. Sure. Blue and green. Mother, you don't know the sound of a good horn, the way it slices through night with its groan, how it spills through the city in search of a partner. You scuff across the kitchen with heavy feet, pierce your dinner with a fork. Miles away, I am sick and sweaty, held by a leash, being led through the tar of this town. I'm fumbling for a baggie and a key. It's not supposed to be like this. I am an irreplaceable shade of twilight. I am weighted. Never have I seen your face bend the way a blue note does when I arrive at the door. A crackle in the vinyl, weathered and out of tune. Too far gone to call in, too close to say goodbye. I ring the bell. I say I love you. I get paid. This is our little dance.
Great poem. Thank you. Thank you for reading that. So I just want to end with one final question. What is the single most important piece of advice someone has given you about the process of writing poetry, and what has that meant to you?
That you have to live your life. Like, you have to live your life in terms of, yes, you're a writer, you're always going to be a writer. You're a poet, you're always going to be poeting. But it's really important to like get out there and touch grass, you know, like
Mhm.
especially in this era, you know, we are chronically online.
Yeah.
Um, and that's doing something to us, you know, and with Zoom, you know, it's been a great way to like connect where otherwise we couldn't, but it's tough, you know, like Zoom is conferencing software where
Mhm.
we are trying to connect emotionally, you
Right.
know, and so I think it's really important to, and if you have like a journaling practice or like a different kind of notebook where you lower the stakes of like, I'm not going to write a poem, but what about like, I'm going to write 5 things I see looking out the window, or I'm going to listen in silence for 5 minutes and then write down all the sounds I can hear. And that way, like, you're engaging your poetic muscles, but the stakes are lowered so that you're not, I'm going to sit down and write a product, which is the poem that will
Mhm.
then be published. You know, it's like,
Right.
I think that, um, again, Gabrielle Calvacaresi, someone I learn from all the time about, they talk about like coming to the page thinking about a space for play, you know, and world building,
Mhm.
um, and see what comes up that way, as opposed to this capitalistic view of, you know, I have to write and crank it out, and these 3 poems are going to be in the New Yorker, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I guess the other thing too is just like as we envision like new economies around community poets, publishing institutions, academia, all that, it's like, um really understand that like we all have these different paths and it's like a landscape, you know, and because some people get one thing doesn't mean you're not going to get one thing. It's all different kinds of levels,
Right.
because I think we really can like, you know, we take the scraps and think like, oh, there's nothing for me, you know.
So when you say we take the scraps, do you mean we as poets or just as creative people in general, or?
Yeah, yeah, I just think, creative people in general, poets, just like because, you know, there's just like the machine that's happening, and, you know, prize systems, things like that. It's like, be really gentle with ourselves and each other, and that one person getting one thing doesn't mean you're not getting one thing, you know, it's like, it's ever changing.
Cool. Um, Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. I really appreciate it. And just to remind everyone, your poem is going to appear in the spring edition of West Trade Review, which should be out hopefully by April the 1st. Thanks again, dear.
Thank you.